Yeah,
Cool.
thanks. So yeah, pleasure to give a short talk to you all. My time at the James Hutton Institute really shapes how I think about all this stuff. So happy to present through a small square box to you all. But I think the interesting story for this conference here is a project that I've been involved with in an advisory role, which is the California Land Equity Task Force. So we're going to go to the U.S. To think about, what about land in the US, in particular in California, and agricultural land. So we can go to the next slide. So yeah, I think to set the stage, in a very brief moment, we should think, well, is land on the agenda in the US? Where is the status of how policymakers and activists are thinking about land reform? Then, the real point of this presentation is to give you an inside look into this state-appointed body called the California Land Equity Task Force. And then, I have some reflections that I think hopefully will be interesting for you all. Go to the next. Yeah, so is land reform on the agenda in the U.S.? No, is the answer. But there's not nothing. I mean, so a good example of this is this recent Supreme Court case, Cedar Point Nursery versus Hasid et al., in which a California state access regulation allowed union organizers to access farm laborers who wanted a consultation into private agribusiness land. And the agribusiness owners said, "Get off my land! You're trespassing." And this case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that this access regulation that the state was making constituted a per se physical taking. So kind of the national constitutional right to property was so strong that a state couldn't even provide union access to these farm laborers. We can go to the next. There's another interesting case. If you know about U.S. Land allocation, when the railroads were built, you have this checkerboard pattern. This is an actual picture of public land and private land being distributed here. And so these hunters developed a strategy called corner crossing, in which they found the exact GPS coordinates of the corner so they could travel between the adjacent public property here and do their hunting. But the private landowner didn't want these hunters crossing their land. They would actually bring a ladder and corner cross over the small fence there. And they were charged with trespassing. And but the defense lawyer says, he believed the whole mountain was his, and that but he was allowed to be there like a king. So kind of it sounds similar to the the Green Laird stuff that Annie does, right? And they were found not guilty. And the Supreme Court denied to take up this case. So now this is the law of the land, that these hunters can cross over the fence over someone's private property. So it's not nothing, but there is something that, the private property entitlement is not absolute, right? And go to the next. If we think about agricultural land, there are also some interesting examples. There are 9 U.S. Midwest states where it's slightly reactionary, but it's kind of a fear of the other. But you see these kind of Republican Corn Belt states preventing foreign ownership of land. So they have a state law that prevents foreign ownership. It's mostly kind of geared rhetoric around China, Chinese investment, and the private landowners that mostly run these corn operations are in favor of this type of rhetoric and legal protection that their neighbor's land can't be sold to a foreign investor. But that it is clearly a sign that property is not totally fixed and absolute, and people aren't thinking about it. Can go one more. And there's also 2 Senate bills that are introduced into the Senate by the same Senator, Cory Booker. It's the Farmland for Farmers Act and the Justice for Black Farmers Act. And both of them, in various ways, have kind of legal proposals that would try and prevent institutional investment in farmland, for the Farmland for Farmers Act, and for the Justice for Black Farmers Act to try and raise funding to, when possible, transfer land because of historical racial injustice from either public farmland or other opportunities into Black farmers who would register their interest. Introduced into the Senate is in some ways in American politics, these are like signposting bills because the political window is very far from a vote being passed on these laws, but it does show that there is some interest in addressing problems in either land consolidation or land injustice. Okay. So what's going on in California farmland governance? Well, despite some of these changes, it's very Wild West. You have, multi-million-dollar properties. You have high land speculation, lots of land consolidation. You have apps that are geared towards institutional investors to target land for investment. And you have a 82% of agricultural land is white owned, kind of based off of historical allocation of land, and in some cases people call it stolen land. And if you look at the work of someone like Madeleine Fairbairn writing Fields of Gold, you see since the 2008 food and financial crisis, you see farmland being seen as a target for institutional investment thought of to provide safe returns. Go to the next. To give you a sense of this, a quick story here. There was some news reports that in secret, a mysterious group of investors had purchased 50,000 acres of farmland north of San Francisco in what's called Solano County. And perhaps because of this news reporting, this group had to go public. They were the Flannery Associates, Silicon Valley investors, and their project was something called California Forever. And they were buying up land with the purpose of creating a new city on top of farmland. And if you go to their website, you can see, you can slide the unproductive, Solano ranch land to a nice, bucolic, imagined, urban, almost European-looking city, right? Still very much, the right to dispose of land, farmland, is very much the power of the owner. Okay, so in this milieu, there comes the California Land Equity Task Force, right? Which is interesting. So this was created through the California Budget Act of 2022. And basically, it's a legal mandate, and it says you have to give us a report to the governor's office in California by 2026, January 1st. So it's fairly advanced now. And you have to create policy proposals to address the increasing land consolidation and land inequity, kind of being controlled by large farmers, white farmers, corporate farmers. That's kind of the concern and the mandate of the task force. So we can go one more. So 13 members are appointed to this task force. They represent different members of the farming community, kind of from north to south, different types of commodities, different types of farming operations. There's a strong focus on tribal agricultural lands. And through kind of 2 years of community consulting, it reminds me a little bit of the Scottish Land Commission here, and doing evidence gathering about what are the problems and what should the policies be to change what happens with California's agricultural land. So what's in? Well, the report. So the final draft report is now public. Transparency of this process is kind of mandated by California law here. So you can look at all of the draft documents as they've been created. You can watch all of the public meetings. You can look at all of the evidence collected. And I think it's a great case for future research to kind of study how policies about land are being made. And here is here are the goals of the policy proposals. So there's a strong focus on tribal stewardship and land return, especially disputed land. There's there's proposals to fund and incentivize land acquisition for priority producers. We'll get back to what that means, priority producers. There are efforts to halt and reverse agricultural land consolidation, so specifically pointing out consolidation, and then preserving California agricultural land while also trying to prioritizing land access to newcomers. prioritizing secure land tenure, and supporting urban agriculture. So those are the goals, but what are some of the actual proposals? Well, I think there's some kind of interesting ideas here. There's an idea to establish a restorative land fund. So it's still, mostly this one is operating through the market. So you're kind of doing this willing seller, willing buyer situation. But then in the second bullet here, the proposal is to return publicly held land to California Native American tribes. So direct return or land transfers, which is significantly different. Also to facilitate the return of privately held land to California Native American tribes. So that's a big difference from publicly held land to trying to find, if there's a farmer who considers that their property, but if you look at some tribal dispute that might need to be returned, that creates a whole new can of worms. A really interesting policy proposal to establish a producer pension fund, recognizing that the dream of owning your house on the land that you farm might not be for everyone, but if farmers can have financial security through a pension fund, then that might actually create a diversity of types of new entrants who can make their life on the land. There's this idea that saw yesterday and today about creating a land market monitoring program, which is this idea of a land observatory, also very absent in California, it's piecemeal, but to establish that in the state. And then to kind of focus on the power imbalances between landowner and tenant relationships. So we can go to the next slide. So I think some key takeaways here to think about is, this is all about agricultural land. So, in my understanding of what's happening in Scotland is agricultural land gets a carve out, right? It's the classic agricultural exceptionalism. Of course, you do have a lot of focus on tenant reform and tenant law, but in terms of redistribution of agricultural land or the ability to say, hey, what should be people producing and who should be the producers? I think, in some way that's new that this California Land Task Force is working on. There's a focus on naming the types of people who should be benefiting from land redistribution. That's the priority producers. Behind this name of priority producers is a previous act in California, which is the California Agricultural Equity Act, which recognized that the agricultural land was unequally distributed, that had been distributed based on past racial discrimination, and that created a new class of farmers, which called them socially disadvantaged farmers. And so now there's a legal basis to say, hey, this type of farmer, this class of farmer should be the beneficiaries of some kind of land reform, rather than just individual to community or diversity of land tenure. It's naming a class of people who have been on the outs, who should be brought into the center and enjoy the benefits of land ownership or control. We see a very common tactic of a lot of preemptive rights proposals. So that's kind of a clear trend that exists. And this new idea of land return in some cases, direct land return, outside the market. The land observatory, right? We've heard a lot about who owns Scotland, and that's a kind of a clear model that this works and can move the needle. But the land observatory idea says this should be the state's responsibility. There should be some kind of democratic oversight into what data gets modeled, what questions are asked. And then a classic, funding and training. We can hit the next button. Yes, so what's interesting here is some right-wing outlets picked up this proposal, right, which kind of gets into the politics of this. So I don't know how reputable the Daily Mail is in the UK there, but democratic state plans to take farmland from white owners and redistribute to help rebuild stolen wealth, right? So I think getting back to where the politics of land reform in the US is a really interesting question. And, I'm not a political scientist, but the governor of California, who is eyeing a presidential bid, has his main tactic, Gavin Newsom, has been to tack to the center. And so I imagine many of these proposals, the kind of spicy equity ones, will probably not make it into agricultural policy. But you can clip that for the future, right? But I think it's really interesting to think when you do identify a class of people who deserve redistribution, that is really dipping into the politics, which I know you see some of that in Scotland as well, in some of the tabloids. Okay, second to last slide here. So yeah, if we take this kind of report from the International Panel of Expert Sustainable Food Systems seriously, that we're in a global land squeeze, global trends of land prices doubling since 2008, 1% of largest farms control 70% of the land. That suggests that even in a place as neoliberal and Wild West as California and in the US, land might be back on the agenda. So I think the lessons from Scotland and ability to cross pollinate and learn from each other are apt, and I think that's great. Yeah. So yeah, I hope that's an interesting case where you might not think land reform is happening, and I really appreciate being able to contribute. And on the next slide, of course, a self plug. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I write a newsletter about this and produce a podcast born from James Hutton Institute. So thank you all.